Hello everyone, in this video we're going to be covering a topic from Cambridge IGCSE Biology, the topic of characteristics and classification of living organisms and subtopic features of organisms. Now in this particular video we're going to be covering the section on the five kingdoms. So let's talk about the five kingdoms. We've learned that according to the Linnaean system of classification, we first divide organisms into kingdoms. Now, before diving into the five kingdoms, it's first important for all of us to understand that every living organism is made up of cells. Now, the cell is the basic structural unit of life, and every single organism is made up of cells. There are some organisms, the simpler organisms, are made up of just one cells, while the more complex organisms are they have many cells in their bodies. So let's first understand this cell. Now, this is what a typical cell looks like. So in every cell, you will find a cell membrane. The cell membrane is basically a thin membrane that runs around the cell. And you will find a cytoplasm. Now, cytoplasm is basically the fluid that fills up the inside of the cell. The fluid found inside the cell is called the cytoplasm. And also, every single cell that we come across is going to have genetic material, which is usually DNA. So every cell usually would have DNA within the cell. So now that we've got a basic understanding about the cell, let's start with our five kingdoms. So we've learned that according to the Linnaean system of classification, the organisms are first placed into five kingdoms. So here are the five kingdoms. We have animals, plants, fungi, protoctista, and prokaryotes. So when grouping organisms, our first task is to group them and classify them into one of these five kingdoms. So in this video, we're actually going to be taking a look into detail about all of these five kingdoms. So let's first start with our first kingdom, the animal kingdom. All right. So when we talk about the animal kingdom, this is a kingdom that we are very familiar with, right? We know examples of many, many animals, and animals are usually easy to recognize because they are actively moving around and so on. So basically, let's first take a look at the main features of the animal kingdom. First point, they are all multicellular. So multicellular basically means that the bodies of animals are all made up of many cells. They are many celled organisms. And then their cells contain a nucleus, but no cell walls or chloroplasts. So now what we're doing is we're taking the cell from an animal. If you take any animal and take a cell out of it and observe it under a microscope, this is what an animal cell is going to look like. So let's take a look at the main features of this animal cell. You can see that the cell is having a nucleus, and we know that nucleus holds the DNA. We can see that the cell is having a cell membrane running around the cell. We can see that there is cytoplasm filling up the inside of the cell. Now, when looking at these features of the animal cell, let's note down some important points that you need to notice. You can notice that the animal cell is having a nucleus, and inside this nucleus, you're going to find the DNA, the chromosomes. And another important point to note in this animal cell is that these cells do not have a cell wall. So there's this organelle, this structure called the cell wall, which is present in some cells. So it's important to note that the animal cells do not have cell walls. And also with regard to the organelle called chloroplasts, if you take a look at this animal cell, you can see that there's no such thing called chloroplasts. That's because animal cells do not have chloroplasts. So what exactly is a chloroplast? A chloroplast is basically a tiny organelle found inside some cells, which help those organisms to photosynthesize and produce their own food. So animal cells do not have chloroplasts, and that means they cannot produce their own food. So that's a fact. All animals, they cannot produce their own food. So if animals can't produce their own food, how then do they get their nutrition? So here's how they get their nutrition. They feed on organic substances made by other living things. So these are the main features of the animal kingdom. So now that we are done with the animal kingdom, let's move on to our second kingdom, which is the plant kingdom. So when we talk about the plant kingdom, let's look at the main features. They are multicellular. Once again, all plants are multicellular. The cells contain a nucleus, chloroplasts, and cellulose cell walls. So let's take a look at the details of this plant cell, which is shown over here. We can see that this plant cell has a nucleus, it has a cell membrane, it has a cytoplasm, basically the three important features that were shown in animal cells. And in addition to that, the plant cell also contains this structure called the cell wall, and also these little organelles called chloroplasts. So I'm just going to note that down very quickly. Plant cells have a nucleus, just like the animal cells, they have a nucleus, and they do have a structure called cell wall. And in fact, the cell wall is made up of a material called cellulose. And also with regard to the organelle chloroplasts, chloroplasts too are present. So these are the features, the main features that you need to note about a plant cell. And it's important to know that the cell wall of the plant cell is made up of cellulose. Now, earlier when I was talking about chloroplasts, I mentioned that the function of chloroplasts is to help an organism photosynthesize and produce its own food. So the fact that plant cells do have chloroplasts indicate that plants are able to carry out photosynthesis, and so they feed by photosynthesis. So these are the main features of the plant kingdom. So next, let's take a look at our third kingdom, the fungi. All right, so let's take a look at kingdom fungi. Let's take a look at the main features. So fungi too are usually multicellular. They have cells having nuclei and cell walls not made from cellulose. So let's take a closer look at a fungal cell. When we observe this fungal cell, we can see that the fungal cell has a cell membrane, has a nucleus, and this cell too has a cell wall, but this time the cell wall is made up of a different material called chitin. It has a chitinous cell wall. So let's just note down those important points. The fungal cell too has a nucleus. It has a cell wall, but this time the cell wall is different to the plant cell. It's made up of a material called chitin. And regarding chloroplasts, do you see any structures, any chloroplasts in this fungal cell? No, because chloroplasts are absent in fungal cells. Now, once again, the fact that fungal cells do not have chloroplasts means that they do not photosynthesize. And if they don't photosynthesize, they cannot produce their own food. So how then do they get their nutrition? They get their nutrition by feeding saprophytically or parasitically. So they feed by saprophytic or parasitic nutrition. So this is about kingdom fungi. We're done with that as well. And we're moving on to our fourth kingdom, kingdom Protoctista. Now, when we talk about the protoctists, there are some protoctists that have chloroplasts in them, which are similar to plant cells. And there are some protoctists who do not have chloroplasts within them, which kind of resembles animal cells. So let's take a look at the main features of the protoctists. They are mostly unicellular, but there are some who are multicellular. They all have a nucleus. Some may have cell walls and chloroplasts. So when we talk about prototists, all of them definitely do have a nucleus. And with regard to chloroplasts, chloroplasts are present in some and absent in some. So the prototists who do have chloroplasts, they can carry out photosynthesis and produce their own food. But the prototists who do not have chloroplasts, they feed on organic substances made by other living things. So this is what you need to know, the main features of kingdom Protoctista. So now that brings us to our fifth and last kingdom, which is kingdom the prokaryotes. So when talking about the prokaryotes, the main features of the prokaryotes is that they are often unicellular. So prokaryotes are often unicellular. They have cell walls that are not made up of cellulose and cytoplasm, but no nucleus or mitochondria. So let's take a look at the diagram of a prokaryotic cell. One thing that you must notice, one of the most important points about the prokaryotes is that the prokaryotic cell does not have a nucleus. Now you can see this very well in this particular diagram. You can see the DNA of this prokaryote is just suspended within the cytoplasm. You don't see any structure called the nucleus, and this is one of the most important features of the prokaryotes. So they don't have a nucleus, they don't have other organelles such as mitochondria, but they do have the cytoplasm, and they might have, some of them have the cell walls and so on. But the most important thing you need to know is that they do not have a nucleus. This is the unique feature of the organisms belonging to this kingdom. So that's about the prokaryotes. That's the most important thing you need to know about them. And that brings us to another this other topic we need to discuss about regarding the viruses. Now, we've all heard of viruses. We know there are viruses that cause certain diseases and so on. So when we talk about viruses, which kingdom do viruses belong to? Now, we've discussed the 5 kingdoms. Which kingdom exactly do viruses belong to? So the answer is viruses do not belong to any kingdom because they are not part of any classification system. So you might wonder why. Why aren't viruses a part of the classification system? So here's the thing. Now, to consider an organism as living, there are 7 basic life processes that it must show, right? Now, when talking about viruses show only one of these life processes, which is reproduction. So basically, the only thing that viruses can do is they take over a host cell and they make multiple copies of themselves. So basically, out of the 7 life processes, the only life process shown by a virus is reproduction. And that is why we can't really consider it as a living thing. So when taking a look at the virus body, it basically contains the genetic material covered by a protein coat. So that's what you need to know about viruses, and that brings us to the end of this section. All right, so now let's take a look at a few questions from the question bank. So here's our first question. Euglena is a single-celled organism depicted in the diagram below. Which of the following structures would also be found in animal cells? So basically, they're asking you to find the common structures in the euglena as well as in the animal cell. So let's take a look at our 4 answers given here. The first answer is talking about chloroplasts, and we know for a fact that chloroplasts are absent in animal cells. Let's jump on to the third answer. The third answer has to do with a large permanent vacuole, which is also absent in an animal cell. And the fourth answer, once again, has chloroplast, which we know is absent in animal cells. So our answer is definitely answer number 2. Let's take a look at one more question before wrapping up. So here's our second question. The diagram shows a liver cell. Which features are present in this cell and also in most plant cells? So if we talk about a liver cell, we know that this is an animal cell. So they're basically asking you for the structures that are common between an animal cell and a plant cell. So if you take a look at these answers, you will see that the most appropriate answer is answer number 4. Both animal cells and plant cells have cell membranes and cytoplasm. So that brings us to the end of this video. I hope all of you have got a good understanding on this topic. So stay tuned to our next video. Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to be covering a topic from Cambridge IGCSE Biology, the topic of characteristics and classification of living organisms, and subtopic features of organisms. Now, in the previous video, we learned about the 5 kingdoms, and we learned how when we take the living organisms, we first classify them into one of 5 kingdoms. And one of these 5 kingdoms was the animal kingdom. So basically, in this video, we're going to be learning about the groups within the animal kingdom. So when we talk about the animal kingdom, there are actually 2 main groups that we're going to be talking about. There are a group of animals called the arthropods, which is basically discussed in this slide over here. And there's another important group of animals called the vertebrates, which is actually discussed in the next slide. So let's first start with the arthropods. We're going to be learning about these animals called the arthropods. So here are some examples of arthropods. Now, when we consider these arthropods are all invertebrate animals. Now, what does this term invertebrate mean? It basically means that all these animals which fall under this group do not have a backbone. And in addition to that, there are actually 2 other unique features of arthropods. The first feature being that all arthropods have jointed legs. And the second feature being that arthropods have an exoskeleton. So these are 2 other unique features of arthropods. And now let's take a look at the subdivision of arthropods, the groups within arthropods. So when we learn about the arthropods, there are basically 4 other groups within the arthropods. There are a set of arthropods called the arachnids, and there's another set of arthropods called the crustaceans, and there are these other arthropods called insects, and finally the 4th group are the myriapods. So when we talk about the arachnids, basically this includes animals such as spiders and scorpions and so on. Then crustaceans include animals such as crabs, lobsters, etc. Insects include animals such as the ladybug, ants, flies, mosquitoes, butterflies, and so on. And the myriapods include animals such as the centipede and the millipede. So basically, we're going to be taking a look at the main features of these groups. Now, when we consider the arachnids, we can see that if you take a closer look at their body, you can see that their body is made up of 2 parts. The arachnids have an abdomen and a cephalothorax. And if you count the number of legs, you will see that the arachnids have exactly 4 pairs of jointed legs. And a closer look at the arachnids will show you that they don't have any antennae. So these are the main features of the arachnids. So now let's move on to the second group of arthropods, who are the crustaceans. Now, crustaceans include crabs and lobsters and prawns, etc. So if you think about the crustaceans, these crustaceans have more than 4 pairs of jointed legs. And a unique feature of them is their chalky exoskeleton. Now, we've all seen the hard shell around a crab and a lobster, right? So that's their hard exoskeleton. And the next feature is that crustaceans breathe through gills, and they all have two pairs of antennae. Then moving on to the third group of arthropods, which are the insects. Now, this is a group that we are very well familiar with. We see ants and mosquitoes and so many types of insects on a daily basis. So when we talk about the insects, the body of an insect basically has three parts. The body is made up of the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. And when you count the number of legs, you will see that they have exactly three pairs of jointed legs, and they have one pair of antenna, and they also have two pairs of wings. So these are the important features you need to keep in mind about the insects. And that brings us to the fourth group of the arthropods, which are the myriapods. And like I mentioned, this includes the centipede and the millipede. Now, the myriapods are a group of arthropods who have long bodies, and their body is divided into many segments. And if you study each segment, you will see that each segment contains at least one pair of jointed legs. And a closer look at this myriapod will show you that it also has a pair of antennae. So these are the four groups within the arthropods, and these are the main features you need to keep in mind. So that's about the arthropods. And now that we've completed this group, let's move on to the next group within the animal kingdom, who are the vertebrates. So let's quickly move on to the next slide where we're going to learn about the vertebrates. Now, the vertebrates are basically a group of animals who have backbones. So an animal with a backbone is called a vertebrate. And when we talk about vertebrate animals, there are actually 5 groups of vertebrates. What are these 5 groups? We have the fish, we have the amphibians, we have the reptiles and the birds and the mammals. So these are the 5 groups of vertebrate animals. And now let's take a look at each of these groups of vertebrates. So let's start with the fish. Now we all know examples of fish. We have sharks and salmon fish and rare fish and so on. So let's take a look at the main features of the fish. So fish usually live in water, right? So they have wet skin. They have loose, wet scales on their skin. And how fish breathe is through gills, right? They have gills for their respiration. And with regard to the reproduction of fish lay eggs without shells in water. So fish lay their eggs in water, and these eggs do not have shells. So those are the main features you need to keep in mind about the fish. Then moving on to the second group of vertebrate animals, which are the amphibians. Now, when we think about the amphibians, this includes animals such as the frog, the toad, the salamander, and so on. So let's take a look at the features of these organisms. Now, the amphibians, they have smooth, moist skin. They have moist, slimy skin. And if you take the adult amphibians, they usually live on land, while the larvae usually live in water. So with regard to their respiration, the adults usually have lungs to breathe in and breathe out, while the larvae usually have gills for their respiration. And finally, if we look at the way they reproduce, amphibians, they too lay eggs without shells in water. So basically, this is the same feature we learned for fish, right? Fish and amphibians, both of them, they lay eggs in water, and these eggs do not have shells. All right. Okay, so that brings us to the third group of vertebrates, that are the reptiles, right? Now, when we talk about the reptiles, this includes animals such as snakes and tortoises and lizards and so on. So what are the main features of these animals? They all have dry skin. They have dry, scaly skin, and they too lay eggs, but they lay their eggs on land. So unlike the other two vertebrates, the reptiles, they lay their eggs with rubbery shells on land. So that's about the reptiles. And that brings us to the fourth group of vertebrates, which are the birds. Now, the birds are a unique set of animals. They are unique because they are the only animals who have feathers on their body, and they are also the only animals that have a beak. So, in addition to these two features, birds have two legs and two wings instead of four limbs. And birds also lay eggs with hard shells on land. So birds too lay their eggs on land, and their eggs are covered with a hard shell. And let's take a look at this last feature given here. Birds are endothermic. Now, what does it mean to be endothermic? The term endothermic means that birds are able to control their internal body temperature. And this is a feature seen only by the birds, which we have just discussed about, and the mammals. Only these two groups of vertebrates have the ability to control their internal temperature. All right, so then that brings us to the final group of vertebrates, which are the mammals. And mammals are basically, we are well familiar with this group. We have tiger over here, whales, cats and dogs and monkeys, and obviously even human beings are mammals, right? So what are the features, the main features of the animals in this group? The most distinctive feature of the mammals is how they feed their young ones. Now, if we consider the mammals, the young feed on milk from mammary glands. So the young mammals feed on milk from their mother's mammary glands. And the other features include having fur or hair on their skin, having a placenta, having external ears, and being endothermic. So these are the features you should know about the mammals, and that brings us to the end of the vertebrates. I hope you all got a good understanding on these two groups within the animal kingdom. So now let's try a few questions from the question. All right, here's our first question. The bodies of these arthropods are lengthy and multi-segmented. To which species does this group of animals belong to? So we've learned of one group of arthropods who have long bodies and the body is multi-segmented. And we know that this group is the myriapods, right? All right, let's take a look at one more question before wrapping up. Which group does not contain animals that are arthropods? So they've given us the answers: crustacean, arachnids, annelids, and insects. So the only group that we have not learned under arthropods are the annelids. So that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you all understood this section well. So stay tuned to our next video. Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to be covering a topic from Cambridge IGCSE Biology, the topic of characteristics and classification of living organisms, and subtopic features of organisms. Now, in the previous two videos, we've been discussing about the five kingdoms, and then we learned about the groups within the animal kingdom. So in this video over here, we're going to be discussing about the groups within the plant kingdom, and we're going to take a look at plant classification. Now, when we think about the plant kingdom, there are thousands of species of plants living on our planet, right? Now, if you take a minute to think about all of these species of plants to get an idea about them, you will understand that a common feature shown by all of these plants is the fact that they all have some part of it that is green. So a characteristic green color is shown by all of these plants, and this green color is caused by the pigment called chlorophyll. So that's the feature shown by every single plant. They all have this pigment called chlorophyll, which gives them a characteristic green color. So speaking of chlorophyll, what exactly is chlorophyll? Chlorophyll is basically a pigment, a green colored pigment. And the function of chlorophyll is to absorb light energy, which is needed for the process of photosynthesis. So all plants carry out photosynthesis, and for photosynthesis, light energy, sunlight is required, and chlorophyll performs the function of absorbing this sunlight. All right. So now that we've understood about chlorophyll and the characteristic green color, let's talk about the groups within the plant kingdom. So plant kingdom is a huge kingdom, so it's definitely a good idea to divide it further into smaller groups. So when we talk about the groups within the plant kingdom, an important group of plants are the ferns. So all of us have seen ferns, right? So ferns are basically a simple type of a plant. I'm just going to take a minute and quickly draw up a diagram of a fern. All right, so here's a simple diagram of a fern. You can see, you can understand that it's a very simple type of a plant. It contains leaves and an underground stem and roots of its own. So the leaves of a fern are called fronds. So the leaves of the ferns are called fronds. And one thing you need to understand about ferns is that ferns do not produce flowers. They are non-flowering plants. So if a fern doesn't have flowers, you must understand that it has to have some other form of reproduction to produce new ferns, right? So, what structure do ferns have in order to help them with their reproduction? Ferns have these little structures on the underside of their leaves called spores. So, on the underside of their leaves, they have these structures called spores, and it is these spores that help in the reproduction of these ferns. So, that is the first group of plants that we need to discuss about. And now let's move on to the second important group of plants, the flowering plants. Now, the flowering plants are again a huge group of plants. And what exactly are flowering plants? As the name indicates, of course, it means that these are the plants containing flowers. So, like I mentioned, it's a huge group of plants. All of these plants have flowers on them, so they are able to reproduce sexually by means of these flowers. So what happens is the flowers are the reproductive structures of the plants, and fertilization happens within the ovary of the flower, and that ultimately produces a seed which can give rise to a new plant. So sexual reproduction takes place within a flower, and since this is such a huge group of plants, we divide this group of flowering plants further into two. So there are two groups of flowering plants, the monocotyledons, or known as monocots in short, and the dicotyledons, which are known as dicots. Now, the moment you hear these two terms, these two groups, monocotyledons and dicotyledons, you must be able to understand that the term mono usually refers to one, having one of something, and the term di usually refers to two, having two of something. So these two groups of flowering plants, the monocotyledons and dicotyledons, are classified as such because monocotyledons are the flowering plants that have only one cotyledon within their seeds. A cotyledon is a seed leaf. So if you look at the structure of their seeds, they have only one cotyledon within it. And the dicotyledons are so called because if you take the structure of their seeds, there are exactly two cotyledons within their seed. So that's how we further classify the flowering plants. We classify them into monocots and dicots. So now let's take a look at the differences between the monocots and the dicots. Now, as the name suggested, the monocots the distinctive difference between the monocots and the dicots is the fact that the monocots have one cotyledon within their seed, whereas the dicots have two cotyledons within their seed. But in addition to this key difference, there are also many other differences between the monocots and the dicots. So let's go through these differences. For example, if you compare the leaf of a monocot versus the leaf of a dicot, there is one important difference, there's one very obvious difference between these two leaves. The monocots happen to have leaves with parallel veins running through it. So the veins within the leaf run parallelly to each other. And we call this parallel venation. Whereas if you take a look at a dicot leaf like this, you will see that the veins within these leaves are net-like. So we call this type of venation the reticulate venation. So this is the difference if you study the leaves of the monocot and the dicot. And another difference between the two types of plants is the arrangement of their vascular bundles. If you study the vascular bundles of a monocot, you will see that they are complexly arranged, as you can see in this diagram. But if you study the vascular bundles of a dicot, you will see that they are orderly arranged in the form of a ring. So there's an organized arrangement in the dicot vascular bundles. Then let's look at one more difference with regard to the roots of a monocot and a dicot. If you study the roots of a monocot, you will see the roots look something like this, and we call this the fibrous root system, whereas the roots of a dicot have this structure where there is a main root running down, and from this main root, lots of side branches arise. So this system of rooting is called the taproot system. So monocots have the fibrous root system and dicots have the taproot system. And this brings us to the final difference we need to understand between the monocots and the dicots. So let's read through this. The floral parts usually exist in multiples of 3 in monocots, whereas in dicots, the floral parts usually exist in multiples of 4 or 5. So what exactly does this mean? Let's take a look. Now, given here is a monocot flower, and we're going to analyze this monocot flower a bit more closely. So if you study this monocot flower, you can see that it has, this particular flower is having 6 petals on it. So there are 6 floral parts, and 6 is of course a multiple of 3. So all monocot flowers, if you take a look at their floral parts, they exist in multiples of 3. Whereas in contrast to this, if you take a look at a dicot flower, and if you count the number of floral parts in a dicot flower such as this, so let's count the number of flowers in this dicot flower, you can see that there are 5 petals, and 5 is a multiple of 5, of course. So that's how dicot flowers work. They usually have their floral parts in multiples of 5 or 4. So these are the difference between monocots and dicots. And this is actually something that comes up quite frequently in your exams. So make sure that you study these differences between the monocotyledons and the dicotyledons. So that's all you basically need to know. So before we wrap up, let's take a look at a few questions from the question bank. All right, so here's our first question. Which one of the following is a characteristic of a dicotyledon plant? So here are our 4 answers. They have flowers in multiples of 3. Now this statement is wrong because dicots have flowers in multiples of 4 or 5. They have broad leaves with the presence of reticulate venation, which is correct. We know that dicot leaves show reticulate venation. They have leaves with parallel venation, which is again wrong. And if we look at the 4th answer, it says that dicots possess fibrous root, which is again wrong. So our correct answer is answer 2. So let's move on to our next question, which says both of the species in the diagram below belong to which group. So they've given us the diagram of two plants and they want us to identify which group of plants this belongs to. So let's take a look at the description given here. These plants have leaf-like fronds which have structures containing spores on their lower surface. So we've learned about this group of plants and we definitely know that these two plants, the plants being described are ferns. So that's our answer for that. So that brings us to the end of this video. I hope all of you got a good understanding on this topic. So stay tuned to our next video.